So, good morning, good afternoon, welcome. Thank you for joining this session. My name is Adrian Cooper. I'm the field CTO for the NetApp UK public sector team. And the topic of discussion for this session really centers around the use of software as a service applications, and really just to highlight some of the considerations organizations should have with regards to how they secure, backup, and protect the data that sits within those SaaS platforms. So if we start just with a little bit of context, I think what we've seen is we have seen a significant growth in the utilization of software as a service over the last probably 5 years or more. And that growth continues to outpace quite significantly the deployment of software in the traditional context of a data center. And the data shows us and tells us that, up to 85% of organizations expect to use software as a service applications if they don't already do so during the course of the next 12 months. And the reasons for that are multiple and various, but not least the fact that organizations are keen to place the emphasis for delivery, service levels, upgrades, software patching, etc., with the vendors themselves, rather than have to manage that activity themselves. So what that brings is potentially a much simpler model of consumption. So all of the considerations around hardware failure, all of the issues around software patching, testing, release and availability, all of the protection mechanisms that need to be put in place for different disaster scenarios and or application failures are well and truly in the sort of responsibility of the vendor. But I think one of the areas which there is perhaps a little confusion in the market sometimes and misinformation is that the data itself, the data that your users will create using these platforms and will use in order to deliver services to your customers and partners remains the responsibility of the end user customer. And Microsoft, of which we're focusing here, and Salesforce, who are probably the most prevalent SaaS vendors that we see in the market at the present time, both make it very clear that whilst they have a degree of backup and data protection within their platforms, fundamentally it is the end user's responsibility and the company's responsibility to protect and back up and secure their own data. And statements by Gartner at the bottom of the slide make it quite clear, for example, with Office 365, that whilst the integrated backup function is there, it does not always enable data recovery in all of the situations. And the SLA that Microsoft provide does not address the issue of data recovery. Now, to understand the potential risk that creates, I think we need to understand the various sort of threat envelopes that can exist and the types of areas that having an effective backup policy can help to mitigate against. So, we have things like accidental deletion through to things that are more nefarious by nature in terms of ransomware, viruses, and insider threats, etc. And we've seen a huge uptick in the awareness of this, I think, during the last 6 months of COVID. And just this morning, there was a headline news on the BBC talking about the increased threat of ransomware being seen by, universities in particular. Obviously, they have lots of additional students joining, perhaps where those students are less able to deploy the data protection capabilities that are in place by the university as they get used to studying in a different environment and utilizing perhaps their own technology platforms. So these various threats are very real, and what we're seeing is, I think we're seeing a raised consciousness of these across across the public, and also within the industry. And the significance of these can get to the point at which they become headline news. Honda had a fairly significant cyber attack globally in the earlier part of the summer. EasyJet, I think last year, was hit by a significant lawsuit as a result of losing customer credit card details. And I think if you look at the details behind some of the breaches reported by Capital One and other organizations in the US, they actually resulted from actual insider so-called trusted people having access to data and selling that data for personal gain. So I think awareness at board level certainly is growing, and I think that organizations are now much more alert to these risks than they were perhaps sort of some time ago. And I think with regard to losses attributed specifically to software as a service platforms such as Office 365 and Salesforce, again, there are news stories that one can point to that sort of prove that these platforms are somewhat averse to these same risks as well. And things like data corruption, accidental deletion of user files, as well as systemic failure of the platform, can all be reasons why organizations have suffered from data loss. So with that context, it's also important as well that we reflect the fact that increasingly now data is really at the heart of almost every business. Every business is becoming digital. Every organization is using data in everyday transactions with consumers, with citizens in the public sector, with business-to-business transactions, and so on and so forth. And you can see here that some of the reasons that organizations are keen to avoid any risk to that data. And the threat is real and growing, as we know, and the costs are significant, both in terms of potential reputational damage, the loss of business confidence, customer loss, and financial loss. And I think, when one looks back at some instances, and I think it was one of the UK mobile telecoms providers that did report a significant loss of consumers as a result of a data breach they had maybe in the previous fiscal year. So maybe these things become apparent only after time and only after customers have been able to exit contracts that maybe tie them in for 12 months or so. So that's the context. Following this, there will be a session talking about how NetApp is helping our customers to mitigate against those threats by providing a easy-to-use, extensible backup and data recovery solution for both Salesforce and Office 365. So I would encourage you to please join that session. And you have the option of using the platform provided by SNS to ask specific questions of their experts or indeed our expert team at NetApp, and you can request further information as well. On the link in the slideshow, which will be distributed afterwards, there's also a link to enable you to install and use a 30-day free trial of SaaS backup in your own environment. So the try before you buy is one of the best ways of seeing the value that this type of tool can provide you. But for now, thank you for joining. I hope that session was at least useful in getting that context, and I look forward to perhaps you listening to other sessions that we're going to make available for you. Thank you.